I will now call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 140 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage.
Most of you in the room know the rules, where to keep your device, etc., so that you're not going to be causing any kind of static backfeed for the interpreters. And remember to read that little card, and you have that little decal to put your equipment on. Also, again, this meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and I think you know the rules. Speak through the chair. Whenever you're asking a question, it must go through the chair. Do not speak unless the chair recognizes you. Don't take any pictures of the Zoom, etc., etc. So we've got, most of you know the drill by now. And I would say that Ms. Tate knows the drill by now, right? Okay, good, thanks. So we shall begin. Again, I'm going to try to give you the 30-second thumbs up or shout out or whatever you want to call it to just let you know that you've only got 30 seconds left when we're doing it. So we begin, and I welcome Ms. Tate, Catherine Tate of the CBC here today. And you know you have 5 minutes, Ms. Tate. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, this is my 5th appearance before this committee in 12 months. Each time I have urged you to consider the fragile state of Canada's media industry and the importance of a strong public broadcaster so we can ensure that Canadians continue to have access to reliable, credible news and information produced by Canadian journalists, that they can continue to discover and celebrate Canadian creative talent as well as the excellence of our amateur athletes, and that Canadians can hear and connect with each other no matter where they live. And yet there are those who insist we don't need a public broadcaster anymore, that there are thousands of other choices. But are those choices operated by Canadians for Canadians? Are they dedicated to independent journalism with clear standards? Are they investing in Canadian programs? Are they committed to showcasing our musicians, our writers, in English, in French, and in 8 Indigenous languages? Il y a 90 ans, un gouvernement conservateur a fait un
90 years ago, a conservative government made a choice to invest public money to create a Canadian public broadcaster in order to protect culture for Canadians. At the time, the threat was from American radio stations who were broadcasting to the north of the border. But today, the threat is much greater, and we have a flood of foreign services coming in, and 94% of all digital revenues flowing out of Canada to foreign companies. What is at risk is the survival of a Canadian-owned media and the information that Canadians need.
Continue to invest in their public media, and they invest much more than we do, an average of $78 per capita, more than double that in Canada. CBC Radio-Canada now costs Canadians $32 per year, less than $3 a month. In fact, now is precisely the time we should be investing more in public broadcasting, not less. We have shared with you documents outlining some of the ways CBC Radio-Canada serves Canadians. Here's what's at stake. News and information the majority of Canadians trust. The largest investor in the creation of original Canadian programs, the most popular radio shows and podcasts, a digital platform used by 21 million Canadians each month for access to news with no paywall. CBC Radio-Canada, c'est tout ça. Financé par
That is CBC Radio-Canada. It's a single public broadcaster, and it's paid for by all Canadians in order to serve all Canadians regardless of where they live or what language they speak. At a time when other Canadian media are cutting back, when Canadian writers, creators, musicians, and athletes have fewer opportunities to get noticed and build a career, how does cutting public broadcasting actually make things better for anyone?
Conservative writer, the founding editor of the National Post. He recently said this about defunding CBC, and I quote, "It might make some conservatives feel better emotionally, but it's not going to do anything for the culture of the country, for our understanding of Canada, for the ability of the various parts of the country to communicate with and understand one another, or even argue with one another. It's just going to make things worse. I urge this committee to talk with Canadians, talk with people in Trois-Rivières, Saint-Boniface, Prince Rupert, Charlottetown, and Rankin Inlet who rely on CBC Radio-Canada for their news. Talk with the Canadian authors who see their books become bestsellers after they've been profiled on Canada Reads and Le Combat des Livres. Talk with Canadians who depend on us during a pandemic, wildfires, or floods to find out what they need to know to protect their families. I've had the privilege of speaking with Canadians across the country over the past 6 years. I know the majority love their public broadcaster. Some do not, and I've met with them too.
30 seconds.
We listen to their suggestions on how we can be better, putting journalists in communities where other media have left, launching local podcasts, finding new ways they can share their views about what's important to them. We will continue to transform our services to meet their needs because we exist to serve all Canadians. If I've learned one thing during my tenure, CBC Radio-Canada is a lifeline that links this vast country. Losing it will not make Canada better. Thank you.
Now we're going to go to the question and answer session. And we begin with a round that's a 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Damien. Damien, Mr. Kurek. Sorry, Damien.
Thank you very much,
Please
Madam
begin.
Chair.
6 minutes.
Thank you, and Ms. Tate, thank you for coming back to committee. I find it interesting, in your opening statement, you did not mention the reason why you were called back to this committee, and that is the $18 million in bonuses that CBC paid out. $18 million in bonuses.
Madam Chair.
Yes, is that Mr.
There are two things. One is the sound online is cutting in and out. We're not getting half of what's being said when Mr. Kirk is speaking. So I don't know what we can do to fix that. But well, I'm going to stick to that one. It's very hard to actually hear what he was saying. So I don't know if it's his mic or if it's the room. It was happening a little bit with Madame Tate, but with Mr. Kirk, it was pretty hard to decipher.
So shall we suspend a bit until we figure this out?
I'm
I'm
happy to
sorry.
keep going.
I'm sorry, Damien. Sorry, Miss Tate. Yes, go ahead. Let's find out what's going on. Keurig.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Ms. Tate, thank you for joining the Heritage Committee again. And I find it interesting in your opening statement, you didn't mention the $18 million in bonuses that were paid out. And certainly when I speak to and hear from thousands of Canadians.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Okay, if this is the game that the Liberals simply don't want to talk about the bonuses,
Mr.
then
Keurig,
at least be honest about
there's
it.
a point of order. What is it, Mr. Nur Mohammed?
Well, there are two things I would now say. One is that Mr. Kirk now knows me well enough to know that this is not about playing games. We did have, and we still seem to have, some crackling on the audio, pointing that out. However, I did want to make sure that we are clear about what the mandate of Madame Tate's appearance was today, and I understand it was from the House order in respect of the cuts to the CBC, not about bonuses. I just want to be clear about what it is that the discussion today is supposed to be about.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Certainly wasn't a point of order. And again, it seems like the Liberals are terrified, like Ms. Tate, about talking about the $18 million in bonuses that were awarded to individuals at the CBC. Now, Ms. Tate, in your opening statement, you asked for more money. Yet the last time more money was awarded to the CBC, it went to bonuses. As a show of leadership from the top, can you, and I'm going to, this was asked to you before, and you didn't answer clearly, so I'm going to give you another opportunity here today. Will you categorically reject any bonus that is offered to you as your tenure as the CEO of CBC comes to a close?
Madam Chair, there were a number of questions in that question, if I may.
The idea, if the committee wishes, I can reread the motion. It is about cuts to CBC and the impact of defunding the CBC. That's one of the things that was clear. It was not about bonuses, because if you recall, Ms. Tate was here not too long ago talking about bonuses. So I think we should read that I will read it provided now, including how the Liberal threat to cut funding led to hundreds of CBC Radio Canada job cuts and the effects on smaller communities as promised by the leader of the official opposition and the consequences of defunding the CBC. That's clearly what the motion says.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, I think that it is clear that Ms. Tate, in her opening statement, asked for more money. And Conservatives do not believe that if the leader at the top of the organization is unwilling to make a commitment to say that they won't accept a bonus to what could be the tune of hundreds of thousands of taxpayers' money at a time when people are being laid off. The last time the CBC asked for more money, they paid out more bonuses. Ms. Tate, to you today, out of respect for the organization that you've led over the last number of years, will you reject, if offered, a taxpayer-funded bonus?
Madam Chair, I've appeared at this committee now 5 times, and I believe that I have more than adequately responded to questions about performance pay. I do want to correct the record. The funding that CBC Radio-Canada received, the $42 million, went to save 454 jobs of the 800 forecast jobs that were needed to be cut. So just to be clear, that money went to save jobs. So
just imagine, you say that it went to save jobs, yet still $18 million in bonuses were paid out. $18 million of taxpayers' money went out in bonuses. Ms. Tate, your tenure at the CBC is coming to a close at the beginning of January. Will you commit to not take a taxpayer-funded severance at the conclusion of your tenure?
Let me say, just to clarify, the $18 million was an obligation that the corporation had to the unaffiliated employees, the 1,180 unaffiliated employees. We have a payroll of close to $900 million. If the member believes that we make decisions about performance pay in a frivolous fashion, I have to correct him. These dollars on payroll are put in place at the beginning of every year. So to suggest that funding that was provided at the end of the year was used in that way is simply incorrect.
So $71,000 on average per executive? That's more than the average Canadian makes. Madam Tate, you make more than the Prime Minister makes, yet you refuse to reject a taxpayer-funded severance. So again, I ask the question to you today, Madam Tate. Will you reject a severance paid for by taxpayers at the conclusion of your term as CEO of CBC?
As I've told this committee repeatedly, I have not received performance pay since 21-22. And given the terms of my compensation, like all other GIC appointees, every president and a CEO of every crown includes salary and performance pay. I leave that decision to the government.
But you could reject that today, yet you won't. So as we come to, how much time do I have left?
A minute, but I was going to say, I think I've heard this question asked at least 10 times at this committee in the past. So Ms. Tate has answered it. Would you like to move on, Mr. Kurek?
Thank you, and I will move on by simply saying this. I think that Canadians, and Madam Tate, you said in your opening statement that you speak to Canadians on a regular basis, and internal emails suggested that you sent and that were accessed by access to information, said that there's momentum growing on the defund the CBC movement. And your appearance here today, as has been the case over the last number of appearances that you've made, it's certainly not surprising as to why that is the case. There's decreased trust in the public broadcaster, revenues are down, ad revenue is down, and most importantly, viewers. There are fewer viewers watching your programming. It is, do you have any regrets, Madam Tate, over your tenure as CEO of the CBC?
Ms. Tate, you have 30 seconds.
Madam Chair, may I address the untrue accusations of the member? Every media company in the country is cutting jobs. Our industry is in crisis. In our case, we forecast 800 cuts. And in the end, we worked hard to make sure that the lion's share of those were vacancies. 205 vacancies were cut. So I do believe that we're talking about the wrong things here. Digital revenue has tripled since I began at CBC Radio-Canada. Viewership is, in fact, up on digital platforms because, with all due respect to the member, television viewing in general is down. So I would just say, let us focus on the facts. I provided all the members with this excellent document prepared by my staff on the facts around CBC Radio-Canada. And I really urge you to spend the time to learn about Canadians' viewership behavior. They are online. Canadians are watching CBC on YouTube, on connected TVs.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. I now move to Andrew Dillon for the Liberals. 6 minutes, please. Ms. Dillon.
I thought Ms. Gainey was kicking off this round, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, I have a list in front of me, Mr. Noor Mohammed, and it says Ms. Dillon.
You can put me in, Chair. I'll jump in.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Cotto.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tate. We appreciate you being here. As mentioned, I believe it's been 5 times that you've joined this committee, and we appreciate you being here. The Conservatives have constantly looked for any angle possible to justify the cuts that they would propose to CBC if they had an opportunity. They've been very clear. They're a critic, they're a heritage critic.
Mr. Cotto, people are saying they can't hear you. So we're just going to figure that out. What is wrong with everything today? Will you try again, Michael?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you well. I don't know if anybody else
Okay.
can.
Who said they couldn't hear me?
Everyone.
Everyone except me.
Okay.
So maybe Mr. Kirk could take back the comment he made about thinking that this was some kind of game, because there is an actual audio problem in you.
So, okay. So we know that Conservatives have...
Madame la Présidente.
Sorry, we're going to have to suspend until we fix this. Michael, no one can hear you but me.
Again, as mentioned in her testimony, she's been here 5 times, and it's quite obvious every single time that she appears, the Conservatives want to carry forward an agenda they have put forward to Canadians to get rid of the CBC. We know that the CBC plays such an important role in French Canada, in rural Canada, right across this country. And in addition to that, it's a big part of, I believe, our heritage in this country and supporting heritage. So I guess the first question is there's a lot of misconceptions. I would actually say they're lies that Conservatives put forward when it comes to CBC. They want to create the illusion that the CBC itself is an organization that is losing viewership every single day. And in fact, I've asked you this question, I think, twice now. The fact is that viewership is up when you look at the way people are actually consuming media today. So I guess the question is, where are we today? Has the CBC actually increased its viewership because of the transition into more of an online presence?
For the question. Yes, I mean, I'll take an example of the National because that's often cited as where we have a declining television viewership. And in fact, maybe 10 years ago, there were 1.2 million people tuning in on television, and today there are about 1.3 million people consuming the National, but they're consuming it half on television. There's still a solid number of people who watch linear TV, but the remainder, in fact, an increasing number, are watching on YouTube, on CBC Gem, and on connected TVs. And just to be very clear, so people understand what a connected TV is, it is not a linear television box. It is a connection to the internet. That's why you can get Netflix and YouTube and Crave, as well as CBC Gem, News Network, and all the other wonderful Canadian channels on connected TV. So people need to understand that Canadians have moved online. That does not mean they have moved off CBC.
Thank you very much, and I hope the Conservatives are paying attention to that answer because, for some reason, and I don't know what it is, where the block is, but not the block here, but the block of absorbing the information that's being presented. But for some reason, this question is constantly being asked about ratings. We know that the ratings are up, and we know CBC is doing quite well when it comes to connecting with Canadians. There is it's interesting. The Conservatives are okay with the fact that a lot of our media now in Canada has been purchased by American companies, and here we have, like many G20 countries, a public broadcaster that is owned by the people of this country, that supports Canadian content. And I said this at the actual first meeting you ever came to, that, I grew up watching CBC. A lot of the characters from my childhood were from CBC and TV Ontario, which, I'm a very big supporter of as well. But our heritage in this country, TV shows from the 70s and 80s, they wouldn't have had a chance on American networks if they weren't supported by the Canadian taxpayer. And for some reason, I cannot understand why Conservatives are so anti-CBC, one of the last true Canadian national networks that works directly with Canadians, that's funded by taxpayers, that is publicly owned. I just can't understand why they would be so against it. But yet, when it comes to the trend line that's taking place in this country, when it comes to media as a whole, for some reason, they seem okay that American corporations can own Canadian companies and media now. So it's just, it's very challenging. One of the misconceptions they put out there is that they can actually, keep Radio Canada and get rid of English CBC. And I guess the question back to you is, are these standalone organizations, or are they interconnected at many different levels? Can you just separate the two sections of the broadcasting and just hope they survive, or hope one survives?
Thank you for the question. As I've said here before, the CBC Radio-Canada receives a single parliamentary allocation. Those funds are then deployed 56% to CBC English services and 44% to French services, Radio-Canada. And that's where the division stops, because the services are connected and interdependent in terms of shared station locales, shared equipment, shared technology. And I just take the example, because I failed to mention it earlier, of the Olympics. The Olympics were produced absolutely collaboratively between CBC and Radio-Canada. And in fact, CBC assumes about 80% of the costs because it drives about 80% of the revenue associated with the Olympics. So without CBC, Radio-Canada would not be able to show Canadians the Olympics. So there are many, many programs that we work on together. And I'll just take an example in, let's say, one of our regional stations in Edmonton, where a journalist, a CBC journalist, may be going out, and a Radio-Canada cameraman may be working with that CBC journalist, and the two of them may, in fact, file stories together in their respective languages. So let us be clear. These are not two separate companies. They are one with obviously very profound editorial independence, but with a shared infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tate. To that, your time is up. Michael, thanks. And now we go to Mr. Shampoo for the bloc Matin. 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci, Madame Tate.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Tate, for being back here with us. And you're probably getting sick of us at this point before you leave your position. Ms. Tate, I am part of more than 80% of Canadians who say that they wish to have a public broadcaster. That's very important, especially given the current circumstances. Having an enterprise that provides news in this climate is of key importance, and I think we have to protect and save information, whatever the cost is. And I think CBC Radio-Canada is one of the tools that we need to concentrate on to save news and information. Having said that, there are still legitimate frustrations that are being expressed by users, because we can say users as we are also dealing with online platforms, TV viewers, and others. An example would be the following. Over the weekend, I wanted to watch the Vanier Cup. But when I went on the application, I was asked to log in, and as the match was being broadcast, there was ads being displayed. So, and that was a question I asked myself: why would I need to create an account, even if it's free, etc.? So the question is the following: if we try to maintain a public broadcaster, as is the wish of 80% of Canadians, and of course we want it to thrive in a changing environment with regard to media and information landscape. So maybe the solution would be to address the most frequent frustrations. And our Conservative friends, colleagues here, are against the idea, but you referred to injecting more money that would allow you to rely less on subscriptions and other revenue resources. So the question is the following: do you have any estimations, any guesses as to what it would cost more to the Canadian taxpayer to get rid of, for instance, ads in information or news broadcasts? So what do you think about the potential costs? As Quebecers and Canadians, what would we need to pay more in order to eliminate the most frequently addressed or expressed frustrations? Well, if I can take a second to talk about the frustrations, we live in a digital world, so having access to a digital service I mean, what is it good for? What is its utility? Well, the biggest strength of a digital service is that we are learning every day. We're gathering data on Canadians. Well, I'll give you a more specific point on that. There are online services of CBC Radio-Canada for which you need to pay. They are not available at no charge. So there are, on top of that, the obligation of creating an account. Well, we are now talking about subscriptions and ads. So today, around $400 million of CBC Radio-Canada's budget is, it comes from commercial revenue, ad revenue. So you would need to replace these $400 million. And we also know that some of these are these ads. We're looking at a couple minutes of broadcast programming that would need to be replaced and filled in. And we were talking about $400 to $500 million to remove all these sorts of requirements for payment. Well, if we're looking at $400 to $500 million to replace lost income from ads, and then you would need to fill in some certain minutes of programming. But all of a sudden, that will be a big impact, of course. So just going back to the point of us dealing with a public broadcaster, but there are other public broadcasters that are cheaper, as it were, per capita in other countries. So CBC currently costs about $33 per Canadian, and the average is $78. So the difference between the two would be about $45. So at the cost of $45 per person, people would not be living these frustrations that we talked about. You also said that it's impossible to do cuts in CBC without having significant impact on Radio-Canada, so the French language services. Well, you referred to the Olympics, but that, of course, is once every 4 years for Summer Olympics and the same for Winter Olympics. But on a day-to-day basis, as a vehicle of culture for Quebec and the Francophonie in general, what would the impact be on other types of programming, entertainment, etc., if we went ahead with a defunding of the CBC and Radio-Canada? Well, as I said, the English and French language services are very closely interconnected. Of course, for 100% Francophone program, there wouldn't be a direct impact. But if the funding of Radio-Canada goes down due to the fact that CBC has been defunded, for instance, because these two are closely interconnected, then we would have a problem. Then we would have to make cuts in all aspects of the production, internally and externally, with independent producers.
Thank you very much. I now go to the New Democrats, Nikki Ashton. 6 minutes, Nikki.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to welcome Ms. Tate back to our committee for what I imagine is the final time we'll have these discussions in this capacity. Your regular appearances, Ms. Tate, at our committee reflect how much Canadians care about the CBC and Radio-Canada. You can't represent a rural, northern, or Indigenous community or live in a part of Canada that is Francophone and not understand CBC's and Radio-Canada's importance. For many of us, the CBC has a history of being the only ones that cover our stories. But the CBC's reliance on major cities to sell smaller community stories is a problem. Its board's obsession with rewarding high-level executives exorbitant bonuses while at the same time cutting jobs is a problem. The CBC is our public broadcaster. It doesn't exist to mimic private broadcasters who prioritize bonuses and profits over the jobs of their employees and over local broadcasting. Canadians deserve better from the CBC. We in the NDP do not support the full frontal attacks that we've seen from the Conservatives against the CBC. The CBC is critical to Canada, to a vital democracy, to all of our communities. but we need to see the CBC do better. It's time to ban bonuses at the CBC. It's time to invest in local and regional broadcasting, including in regions like mine, who haven't had a permanent CBC presence and has had its station shut down for years. My first question, and I would end off by saying, Ms. Tate, that I hope that your successor will take this feedback as guidance going forward. We have too much at stake when it comes to the possibility of losing the CBC. In terms of local media, we've heard here in northern Manitoba that the CBC has finally found somebody to perhaps begin in the new year, filling a position that's been left vacant for quite some time in our region. This is very positive news, except for we know that last time that was promised, the contract only lasted 2 months. I'm wondering, this person that is slated to take on this CBC position in the new year, is their contract longer than 2 months? How long can we expect them to stay? Obviously, for us in the north, and I would say in Manitoba, we hope that this is a long-term commitment from the CBC.
I would just say that to the member on, as you well know, we've been trying very hard to fill that position in Thompson, Manitoba. It is near and dear to our hearts, and I very much expect and hope that this next person taking the job will be for a longer period. The person that was there before, it was not a short-term contract. They made the choice to leave themselves. So the commitment is there. Again, as we said a couple of weeks ago, CBC will be committing to hiring 25 new journalists in locations across the country focused on the West and the North, because we recognize the importance of our connection with local communities. As I've said many times, the force of CBC and Radio-Canada is our proximity to Canadians across the country. And so you have absolutely our commitment to do so and to continue to do so, if I may speak for my successor.
When we certainly welcome this new person, and we hope that your successor and the CBC will ensure that regions like ours have the support necessary for their CBC employees to thrive and stick around for the long term, as ought to be part of CBC's mandate. Moving on, you've been clear that due to the Liberal threat of a 3% cut across the board, you had to lay off workers. The Liberals can go on and on all they want about the threat that Conservatives are to the CBC, and they're not wrong, but this is a basic fact. It's this Liberal government's actions that meant hundreds of Canadians don't know where their next paycheck is coming from. Meanwhile, high-level executives got bonuses almost double what the lowest paid workers at the CBC got. If you could change anything about your time at the CBC, would you have given up those bonuses to save the jobs of CBC employees?
Chair, that as we were very clear in our December 2023 statement, we were forecasting a $125 million deficit, and that was due to a number of factors. Pressures as a result of coming out of the pandemic with the inflation and rising costs of production, increasing declines in advertising revenue linked to television, and yes, we also faced a 3% cut from the federal government. That was a forecast, and I should be very clear, it was a forecast over 3 years. The first year was about $11 million. So that was not the deciding factor that tipped the situation for us. It was a piece of it, yes, indeed. There was also $21 million in integrity funding that was linked to the pandemic that we also lost that year. So I would just to be very clear, when we look at our budget, we look at a holistic situation, not single items.
Right, but my question is, would you have given up those bonuses to save the jobs of CBC employees?
As I've said before, performance pay is part of the annual salary calculation that represents about $900 million of payroll. It is separate from the ongoing budgeting that we were doing. The $42 million was used very directly to save 454
Ms.
jobs.
Tate, I think the question here
I think,
is
Mr.
very
Ashton,
clear.
your time is up.
And it was unfortunately
Thank you.
answered.
You have another round. It's a 5-minute round for the Conservatives and Liberals. So, I'm Mr. Giovanni. For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Tate, we've heard you speak about wanting more money from taxpayers. We've heard you talk about job cuts. I'd like to ask some questions about how your business, the CBC, is currently operating. And with the $1 billion of taxpayer subsidies you have, the CBC has to compete with the private sector, including in hiring talent. Is that correct?
No. We don't compete with the private sector. We live in an ecosystem with the private sector. We are complementary to the private sector.
Okay. That sounds like a fancy way of saying compete. So now, does that include having to hire broadcast executives and on-air talent in the marketplace or the ecosystem, as you referred it to?
For sure, there are situations where a on-air talent might go to CBC, as they often do to CTV or to TVA. It is an ecosystem. People move. We want to have those kinds of opportunities for all our journalists.
So to attract talent, would you have to pay market compensation to people you want to bring into the organization?
As I've said before, we aim for what we call P50, which is about 50% of market. So at no time are we trying to beat the market. We average the market.
Okay. Well, you make about $500,000, and plus you haven't ruled out bonuses, so maybe more than that. Would market rates mean that executive vice presidents may be on salary for over $1 million a year?
I'm sorry, I'm not following your logic here.
If you are competing in the ecosystem as you described it, are you having to pay potentially executive vice presidents $1 million a year?
I think the Député Champoux raised this question with me last appearance when we talked about the compensation at Bell and at other TVA and other media companies. We are not paying anywhere near, as I said, we stay to about 50% of market rates.
Gotcha. So could you confirm how many CBC employees may be earning in the range of your salary or higher?
I don't believe anybody at CBC Radio-Canada has a base salary higher than mine.
What about if you factored in bonuses? Would there be salaries that would be comparable to yours?
Yes, there would be at the executive vice president level.
Okay. So would there be any indicators in your business performance that would cause you to consider that you might be overpaying some of your employees based on the performance of the organization? Are there any indicators that would cause concern in your mind to overpayment for what the CBC is producing and what the outcomes are of the
Absolutely not. As I've said before, we do an annual review with the board of directors, with outside experts to check on that very question. We're constantly mapping salaries right through the unaffiliated groups to look at that they are, as I said, at a 50 percentile.
So just to confirm, as you're doing this mapping, there would be nothing that you could foresee that could make you pause and say, this would be a reason why we should not be paying bonuses or high salaries. There'd be no cause for concern that maybe people are being overcompensated with taxpayer dollars at the CBC?
I absolutely do not believe that people are overcompensated. If anything, we are not competitive in the market.
So to the Canadian people who pay all of these salaries and fund the organization, you'd like to say to them now, there's nothing that could come on your radar. There's no data point that could come across your desk that would make you pause and consider maybe we're paying too much, maybe the organization's not performing well enough, maybe we have to restructure how we're doing things, maybe we need a little bit of self-reflection on why the defund CBC movement is growing so exponentially.
As I said before, the reason the board of directors made the decision to do a compensation review was, in fact, to make sure that all the information that we've been working with is, in fact, 100% accurate, and perhaps we should be looking at all the other ways to approach compensation. So there's an openness to change and to review, absolutely.
But declining viewership wouldn't be one, declining revenue wouldn't be one, broad public distrust of your organization wouldn't be one. It seems to me that the average Canadian taxpayer, maybe it would be fair to ask, what would you need to see to consider that the CBC is heading in the wrong direction, and therefore asking for more money, as you have done today, seems not only out of touch, but rather audacious?
Let me be clear. Digital revenues have tripled. CBC Gem, which was launched at the beginning of my tenure, now reaches millions of Canadians. So I think, let's be clear, the facts
What about,
that you are...
Is ad revenue
Excuse me, I
down?
think the time is up. I'd like Ms. Tate to answer the question. Thank you.
Digital ad revenue and subscription revenue are both up. TV ad revenue, as per all media companies, is down or flat, depending on the market. It's actually down higher right now in Quebec than it is in the rest of the country. The country is suffering inflation, so sponsors and advertisers have withdrawn. But quite frankly, to say that viewership and ad revenue are down, and those are the determining features of this last 6 years, is simply inaccurate.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. Thank you. I now go to the Liberals. Mr. Nur Mohammed for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Tate, for being with us again. I think it's clear. I just want to start by saying I think a couple of things are clear. First, if the CBC, which is government funded, is being held to a particular standard, then that same standard, I believe, should be applied to the private sector organizations like Bell Globe Media, who have been Bell and CTV and Post Media, who have been taking millions of dollars in subsidies from the people of Canada. I don't hear the same revulsion from the Conservatives when it comes to the private sector, which continues to hemorrhage money, whose executives are paid in the millions of dollars, and yet we're still gladly laying employees off and taking taxpayer dollars at the same time. So I think it's a bit disingenuous for people to say, hey, listen, we're going to attack the public broadcaster, the only broadcaster that unites Canadians, the only broadcaster that brings the voice of rural communities, of Indigenous communities, of the Francophone community from coast to coast to coast, whose employees, yes, are paid materially less than they might make in the private sector. And I expect, Madam Tate, you in the private sector would make a heck of a lot more money than you make at CBC. And I know many journalists at the CBC and others who work in the executive and other parts of CBC who make a lot less than they might make in the private sector. But they do this because of love for country and because of the mission of the CBC. And it is clear to me that the defund the CBC movement is largely because of the rage farming and ideological stuff coming from the Conservatives. Because for some reason, they want to keep driving division between Canadians rather than having a unified public broadcaster that actually provides high-quality content to Canadians. And so I guess the question I would ask you, Madam Tate, is why do you think Conservatives hate the idea of a public broadcaster that is independent? Pourquoi les conservateurs détestent l'idée d'avoir un radiodiffusion?
Why do Conservatives hate the idea of having an independent public diffuser that will be in the service of Canadians, regardless of where in the country they might be living?
Comment on political matters. All I can say is that defunding the CBC would mean denying 80% of the population of local news, denying thousands of independent producers, creators, musicians, authors, their livelihood. So we can criticize for the last year where CBC, Radio-Canada had to lay off 141 people, and it was very tough. But let us not forget that defunding the CBC represents, at a minimum, laying off 3,500 people at this corporation, plus the thousands of musicians, artists, performers, producers, sound technicians, et cetera, who depend on CBC Radio-Canada. Defunding the CBC would be denying French language, minority language communities from their lifeline to Le Fait Français. Defunding the CBC would be denying the right of the North, of communities and Indigenous communities across the North to hear their news in their language and to connect with the South. It would deny the South from having the ability to learn about the North. It is, to me, absolutely without reason So when you ask me what is the reason, I say to myself, there is no common sense reason for eliminating CBC. In fact, I ask myself the question, why? This organization, this Crown Corporation, was created by Parliament. And why would parliamentarians want to undo this Crown Corporation that has existed for 90 years? If they have a problem with how we execute on our mandate, well, let's fix the problem. We talk to Canadians every day. It's why we launched a show like Cost of Living out of Calgary, because we knew we needed more local shows in the regions. It's why we've launched local podcasts across the country, local fast channels across the country. It's why we're hiring more journalists in the West. We do not see defunding the CBC as a solution. We see it as making Canada worse, not better.
Well, thank you, Madame Tate. I guess building on that, then, we heard another falsehood come from the Conservatives about the fact that the CBC has lost the trust of Canadians. And in fact, that's actually not true. All of the data points to the fact that the majority of Canadians continue to believe that the CBC is a trusted voice, including half of Conservative voters. So I'm not sure which half they're talking to, but it seems to me that if the data shows that at least half Conservatives believe that the CBC is a good thing and many, many others, then it seems like their data points and their research perhaps isn't as solid as they think it might be. I'd like to lean in a little bit on this fanciful notion that Conservatives have that they could, support French language programming in Quebec only. Now, we know that they don't care about French language rights outside of Quebec. We know they don't care about, it's probably too woke to think about Indigenous communities, probably too woke to think about the idea of telling the stories of Canada. So let's talk about brass tacks in Quebec. If they perpetuate this myth that you could run a successful Radio-Canada without CBC's infrastructure, how ridiculous is that exactly? Can you quantify for us what would actually happen if you said we're going to cut all the funding to CBC and we're going to focus entirely on what Radio-Canada does? Your Olympic example was one. What would that actually do to the quality of Radio-Canada's ability to deliver what they're trying to do?
30 seconds?
30 seconds, I'm not sure I can describe it.
Everyone has gone well over their time, so I will give you some leeway to answer the question.
I would just say that the Olympics is just one example. There are many, many examples. The reality is that, as I said, technology is the backbone of the organization. We are now a digital company. The Internet Protocol technology, on which all of our services live, is shared for and paid for by both services. So you cut one out, it is by definition going to weaken the other. I will just point out another example. When I joined CBC, Radio-Canada, GEM was in its infancy. We launched GEM, and Tout.TV was sitting on its own platform. We had two separate platforms. We harmonized those two platforms because it made sense with public dollars to focus on one platform. So CBC GEM and Tout.TV live on the same platform. You take away the financing of CBC GEM that contributes to that one platform, you now have half a platform. So let's just think each of those things where there's technology involved, you are, as I said to Deputy Champoux, we are weakening Radio-Canada.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. I now go to Deputy Champoux for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame Tate.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Tate, how many Canadians rely on traditional television for their information and to have access to cultural programming? Do you have numbers? Just a second. This is a very important question. So in 2018, around 29% of Canadians were only watching linear television and 22% on digital. But after 6 years, in 2023, 11% of Canadians were only on linear television, and now we have 32% on digital. So can you say that people who still rely on linear television, it's not by choice and often, but because they don't have the ability of accessing other content? Exactly. That is why we say we'll never abandon these people. And if I can clarify, in the Francophone market, the number of people who are still on linear TV is higher than in Anglophone Canada. Yes, we like our old TV. So private broadcasters, do they have the same level of responsibility as public broadcasters when it comes to coverage in remote regions? So TVA, Bell, does everyone have the same responsibility of covering regions? They do have responsibilities for regions, but not as comprehensive as ours, because we have a responsibility to provide coverage in the north, in minority communities. So those are really our own obligations. If a conservative government went ahead with the crazy idea of butchering the CBC and at the same time Radio-Canada, would you still be able to, well, with the promise of maintaining Radio-Canada and its programming for French language and culture, how much would it cost if, okay, let's go ahead and defund CBC, but we will keep the services for Radio-Canada. How much would it cost, in your opinion, just a guess, in hundreds of millions of dollars to maintain the Radio-Canada services, to keep them intact, just to show how ridiculous this is? Well, it will be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, because we're talking about the Great North. We have few journalists, so that wouldn't be because we're looking at 1.4 billion in public funds. And if I can add, we have responsibilities. We hold the rights for Olympics, for instance, until 2032. So we have this financial obligation that is also tied into these contracts. Would you agree in saying that this is a very populist and very engagement? Yes. Okay.
Je peux continuer, Madame la Présidente.
Can I continue? I can continue, Chair.
Anyway, Mr. Shampoo, but you're fine. Okay, Ms. Ashton, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tate, we have a problem. You yourself identified the momentum behind the defund the CBC movement. Now, we've all acknowledged that this is core to the conservative ideological attack, but it certainly rubbed Canadians the wrong way to see that the CBC was doling out $18 million in bonuses at the same time that so many Canadians are suffering, and we know a number of CBC employees have been laid off. Local broadcasting is not being invested in the way it is. So going back to what your message is to your successor, if you could change anything about your time at the CBC, would you have given up those bonuses to save the jobs of CBC employees?
Say we because the chairman of the board of directors also underlined we have obligations to the unaffiliated and the union employees at CBC Radio-Canada, and those obligations are legal. And so you keep using the word bonus. Performance pay is part of a person's salary, and it's part of their our contracted obligation to them to honor that. So I would not change that decision. I think it was extremely wise of the board of directors to consider revisiting and looking at all the compensation to make sure to assure Canadians that we are doing the right thing. But beyond that, I cannot say that we would change our position because it was a legal obligation.
Well, Ms. Tate, I think this is, your answer is part of the problem here. I mean, the CBC belongs to Canadians, and without question, there are certain legal obligations, but one would also note that we are in exceptional times. We are at a time when the CBC's mere survival is at risk, and when Canadians want to see a public broadcaster that is accountable to them, not doling out executive bonuses while cutting jobs and failing to invest in local and regional broadcasting. I hope your successor will do a better job when it comes to ensuring that the CBC is not out of touch on that front. We have asked, in the NDP, have asked for a banning of executive bonuses, making sure that CBC employees are kept on the job to ensure that local and regional broadcasting is able to be done the way Canadians deserve it to be. The last thing we need is a CBC that is out of touch with Canadians. Je veux aussi poser la question sur...
I also would like to ask a question on the importance of Radio-Canada. When the leader of the opposition speaks to the media in English, he talks about defunding the CBC, but he never mentions Radio-Canada. It's always just the CBC. So their plan is clear. They want to defund both. Their Quebec MPs will never talk about this, will never say this. So they say one thing in French and something else in English. Can you please describe how the efforts of the leader of the official opposition to attack CBC and Radio-Canada impacting your work?
C'est très difficile.
Well, it's very hard for employees of CBC and Radio-Canada in this current period of uncertainty. There are all kinds of external financial questions, external to our industry, which is in crisis, and of course, people are trying to understand what the real approach of the government is on the issue. But for the time being, I'm telling them one thing: stay focused on the work of delivering credible, reliable information to Canadians. So we must never forget that we have existed for 90 years and we have served Canadians for decades now.
Mr. Berthold, look, for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Hello, Ms. Tate. Ms. Tate, do you acknowledge the fact that 90 years ago we did not have the Internet? We had an entirely different reality, so you keep referring to those 90 years, but that takes us outside the scope of the current debate. And on the other hand, you have parliamentarians who created the CBC in the first place. Do they not have the right to decide on its future? Well, parliamentarians who created the CBC 90 years ago, do they not have the right to decide on its future? But the question is simple, yes or no? It's not a simple question at all. It's very nuanced. Not really, Ms. Tate, because parliamentarians, and you referred to this yourself, you said that it was created by parliamentarians. So parliamentarians now are trying to be mindful about the taxpayers' money and how it's being spent. So for the 1,100 employees who shared $18 million in bonuses, do these employees also receive pay raises every single year? Just to clarify, Chair, it's not just full-time employees.
Ms. Tate, to answer your question, please. Thank you.
Alors, on parle des employés non syndiqués. Hein? Alors, très bien.
So, do these people receive pay raises every single year? Well, it depends. I think over the last 5 years, we had 1.5% increase. So half the raise that was received by our union employees. So it depends on the negotiations, and it also depends on their relationship with the employer because they negotiate separately. So non-union employees, they don't have the right to negotiate pay raises. So unilaterally, CBC decides on how much they will get in a raise. Well, it also depends on the Treasury Board. But so their salaries go up, and they also receive bonuses, which totaled $18 million, and these are exorbitant numbers. Well, on average, it amounts to $15,000 per employee, well, which is a significant percentage of their pay. So in addition to the raises, they receive these bonuses. Do you find this to be normal in a period where we are going through harsh, difficult economic times for CBC Radio-Canada, that the employees are receiving bonuses at this level in addition to pay raises? Well, Mr. Berthold, we are below the average in the industry. So if you have someone who makes $90,000, it means that that's less than someone else who works at a department or at a private company. So you're giving the impression that these are enormous salaries, but that is not the case. We are always trying to attract people to come and work for CBC Radio Canada. How many employees make more than $200,000 per year? I don't have that off the top of my head. Well, can we get that information for 100 to 200, 200 to 300, 300 to 400 segments? Mr. J, I have another question. Now, CBC can do a whole series of things in terms of its programming. But here at the Conservative Party, we want to preserve Radio-Canada. And you referred to a document a couple minutes ago, and I think it's proof that CBC is failing, because when I look at the number of hours people spend watching TV, the number of hours people spend on the social platforms created by CBC, unfortunately, we see that it's a failure. And especially in Quebec, we need a strong public TV, public broadcaster. And I was looking at the average number of hours that are going down rather faster in English than in French. So Radio-Canada numbers are propping up CBC, if you will. And if we cut CBC, then we would be able to maintain the quality at Radio-Canada, because there are experts who would be able to protect Francophone culture, and I would like to underline their contribution, because Radio-Canada is really exemplary in terms of being a public broadcaster in our region. So isn't CBC bringing Radio-Canada down, if you will, because you're investing so much public money, public funds into CBC as opposed to Radio-Canada? Well, listen, as I've said many times, we are asking Canadians to support. Are we going to ask all Canadians to support an organization for only 20% of the population? Because we have 80% of the population who tune into the radio, 95,000 hours of local radio every year, and 45,000 hours of audiovisual production, TV production. So saying CBC is a failure, you seem to think that we can really go back in time to the era of Anglophone television. But in that market, it's not just CBC that has been losing viewership. People are migrating towards YouTube, other platforms, and we have been seeing this phenomenon since I assumed this role. We had a very limited audience on CBC Gem, but now we have 2 million people every week, so it is a real transformation. But that's out of 40 million Canadians.
Over time, it's really getting to be ridiculous. Come on, let's go now. So I'm going to go to.
She was answering, Ms.
I'm going to go to Ms. Gainey. I know. No, I'm not saying it. I'm just saying you guys. It's a generic term. It's a generic term, Mr. Berthold. Okay, so I'm going to go to Ms. Gainey.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci à.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Tate, for being with us once again, probably one final time. Well, regarding the issue around CBC Radio-Canada, a couple of weeks ago, the Conservative MP who's responsible for these issues, they were not able to answer the clear question of whether CBC Radio-Canada should remain in place or not. But that seems to be a very important issue for Conservatives. and I am not really comfortable with that. Both are important, but especially Radio Canada is very important for the Francophone communities across the country, but especially in Quebec. We absolutely need Radio Canada. So on that point, so CBC and Radio Canada share buildings across the country. Would that be a true statement? In all offices, that is the case, in all buildings. So they work together in the same offices. Yes, exactly. So if you get rid of an office in Toronto for which Conservative MPs have this big plan, so if you get rid of these offices, that will not only impact CBC, but also Radio Canada. Yes, for instance, in the example of the building in Toronto, we have Radio Canada employees who work in that building, so they would be out of an office and they would find themselves on the street. So can you make cuts at CBC without harming Radio Canada? No. So I think it's important that this be very clear. You cannot separate the two. They work together, and this also highlights the importance of bilingualism across Canada. I think it is extremely important to underline the fact that the two services work together, and you cannot implement an agenda of defunding the CBC without really having a very negative impact on Radio Canada. Isn't that the case? Exactly. And if I can give you another example, for instance, thinking of our service, Curio, that is geared towards teachers and schools across the country. This service has programming in French and in English. And this is a tool for teachers across the country to have access to the news in French and in English for their students. So this is a very, very important service. I fully agree with you on that. Even myself, as a mother, my children watch television in French a lot, but they also watch hockey games. We often do that as a family in French to reinforce their French language. So it's very, very important that these services exist. And I'm sure that there are many families who appreciate the availability of these services.
To the top here, I just wanted to remind or get an answer to, is it true that every G7 country has a public broadcaster? I'm sorry, this sounds...
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I recall in one of your earlier visits, you had some interesting data on the price per head, for example, or per citizen, in a sense of the cost to run or deliver public broadcasting. Did you have those available with you? It seemed to me that we were in a position here in Canada to be delivering really extraordinary value for what it costs actually each citizen.
Yes, I think, when we talk about $32 or $33 per head compared to an average of $78, let's not forget you have German public broadcasting at $150 a head. Let's just remember also that Canada is a unique landmass, the second largest on the planet, and we're delivering across 6 time zones in English and French and 8 Indigenous languages. So not only are we delivering television, radio, digital, streaming services, podcast services, in all of those languages, we're doing so over a vast territory, which means that the value and the sort of the cost-benefit analysis is extraordinary. What we deliver to Canadians is unique on the planet, and it is precious, because if I can say again, as I said in my opening remarks, we are the only national media service that connects all of the dots: east, west, north, south, English, French, and Indigenous. It's an extraordinary privilege. It's an extraordinary treasure for this country.
I agree with you, and it's very disconcerting when we have people in elected office saying that trust is down and viewers are down and ad revenue down, when you've shown us time and time again in this committee and just through publicly available information that in fact trust is actually high. The viewers and listeners and the readers are up. The digital ad revenue, I believe you say it tripled, while other revenue is somewhat flat. It is dropping, as you've said, across media sectors and across the landscape. So the performance is there, and it is also valued by Canadians. So I would also like to take this chance while you're here with us again at committee to thank you for your work and your service at CBC Radio-Canada, and to wish you all the best in the next chapter. Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gainey. I now go to a third round, and we begin for the Conservatives, Mr. Waugh. Kevin, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Tate, for appearing, as you said, 5th time in 12 months. 2 months ago, the CBC, your organization, said the ad revenues were down, and you've stated today that that is the case. Last year at this time, your organization made the biggest staff reduction ever. So since, and you've admitted this, $1.4 billion of public funding accounts goes to the CBC. Now we know the ad revenue is down, which makes up, I think, 30% of the commercial activities for the corporation. Are you planning then any staff reductions in the month ahead?
There are a couple of things I'd like to correct, Madam Chair, if I may. The biggest job reduction ever in the previous 10 years before I arrived at CBC, there were over 1,000 jobs cut at CBC Radio-Canada. The net loss of jobs in the 6.5 years that I have served is actually 90, because, by the way, we also create new jobs. We're talking here about 141 occupied positions that were lost. So let's not
move on,
let's deal with facts here. In terms of TV ad revenue, I have said repeatedly.
Yeah, we know that.
Okay, so what is your question?
My question is, are you going to reduce staff like you did last year in December? The private sector has already started staff reductions, as you know. Last year, you followed them in the month of December. Are you going to do that again?
So I will say and I can say this very openly to this committee, that thanks to the $42 million that we received, we will deliver the budget for 24-25, which ends in March, without further staff reductions.
You said at the beginning you need more funding. You said that in your opening 5-minute statement. Have you asked the minister or any of the Liberal cabinet ministers for more funding going ahead for 24-25?
Since I began this job in 2018, I have been asking all stakeholders. I have met with ministers, I have met with MPs from both sides, all sides of the table, to talk about the structural financial challenges that CBC Radio-Canada faces. I just described how with $32 per head, we're delivering enormous value. And I have been speaking about the need for more funding.
How much more?
I started with, and I think I said so to Deputy Champoux, we need in the $400 to $500 million range to have sustainable, manageable funds to have a vibrant, robust service. I mean, I just, if I may, this talk about TV revenues being down. Do you think that CBC Radio-Canada or Radio-Canada alone can compete with billions of dollars from the streamers like Netflix and Amazon?
Well, let me ask you this.
Impossible.
Your key performance indicators, which you have not met, and I think that's why the public is a little upset with the bonuses. You only have met 3 of the 14. You admitted here last time you moved the goalposts so that you could get the KPIs. I think that's why taxpayers in this country are upset with you and the CBC board right now. You've moved the KPIs so you could get the $18.3 million in bonuses and over $3 million in executive bonuses. That is the issue with the CBC right now, Ms. Tate, which you appear to not read the public on this. They are upset with you on this.
I'm very sorry. You're misrepresenting the facts.
I'm not.
Yes, you are. I'm very sorry, Madam Chair. We do not move the goalposts.
You admitted it last time.
Our KPIs are based on market data.
Can you allow the witness to answer the question you asked her, Kevin?
It's like football. You moved the goalposts so you could get your KPIs so that you could get the $18 million in bonuses. We all know that. You've admitted that in previous testimony at the Canadian Heritage Year. And that's why Canadians are upset.
Ms. Tate, please answer the question.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I have been asked the same questions over and over again. I have answered the questions. If the purpose of this appearance is to simply throw a barrage of insults in my direction, to discredit the organization, it is totally unproductive.
Ms. Tate, I'll move on. Olympic contract for...
You have 1 minute. One second, Mr.
1 second or 1 minute?
1 second.
Oh, I'm done then. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coteau for the Liberals. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And again, thank you to our witness today. It's pretty clear what the Conservative agenda is. It's to destroy the public broadcaster and replace it with American-owned media, for-profit media. It's very clear what they stand for and what their agenda is. It's clear in the last 5 meetings. It's clear today. And again, I want to thank our witness for bringing some, I would say, some facts forward that are completely counter to every single thing the Conservatives are saying. So I just want to ask you a series of questions. I would just ask if I can get very short answers, just so we can be on the record here today when it comes to the CBC Radio Canada, and the perception that the Conservatives are trying to present. So really quickly, is viewership up or down?
Depending on the platform, up.
Okay. Support and trust in CBC Radio Canada. Are Canadians supportive of CBC Radio Canada?
As we've seen in multiple third-party surveys, and I'm talking about non-CBC surveys, Radio-Canada remains the most trusted source of credible news in this country. The Polar survey also indicated that CBC Radio-Canada is the most admired media brand in the country. There are many surveys that indicate that CBC and Radio-Canada remain very much loved among Canadians.
Internationally, how is CBC perceived by other G20 countries?
We're considered one of the most innovative on the planet. The Internet Protocol-based center, La Nouvelle Maison in Montreal, for example, has been visited by broadcasters around the world. The work we're doing in Toronto on something called the Universal Production Platform is recognized as groundbreaking work. We are considered innovative and solutions-oriented with respect to the challenges that all public broadcasters face today. Sorry, that was a bit long.
In regards to digital ad revenue, where are you today?
We count ad revenue and subscription revenue together, so the number was at 38 million in 2018, and today it's about 105 million.
Remarkable. Are you the only national bilingual broadcaster in this country?
Yes.
Okay. If CBC was cut, what would happen in rural Canada?
They would be denied local service, news and television and radio.
What's your position, CBC, in regards to diversity and inclusion?
We consider that CBC Radio-Canada's mandate is to serve all Canadians, and that is why for the last 4 years we've made a very, very concerted effort with an enormous success to be more representative, not only in our workforce but also in our programming. I point to the wonderful Radio-Canada series Lakay-Nu, now renewed for a 3rd season, and I point to shows like Allegiance in Surrey, BC, based in the Sikh community, and I point to North of North, a new show, first ever comedy series produced in Iqaluit, a comedy show produced by Inuit creators.
My last question, and I always end with this, if you can recall. How is CBC doing when it comes to supporting young children in this country?
CBC Kids and CBC Mage, Radio-Canada Mage, Mon Actualité du Jour are two critical services that are committed to media literacy. We have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of visits online to our programming, to various services for kids. And I mentioned just a minute ago, Curio, our educational service that goes to schools across the country. We are critical to educating and informing the next generation of viewers.
Well, thank you very much. And again, this will probably be the last time you'll join us at this committee. On behalf of myself and I'm sure many other members, thank you for your contribution to Canadian culture and heritage.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coteau. I now go to Martin Champoux for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Tate, you often went back to answers you gave to me. You gave those answers to our Conservative colleagues. I would invite them to listen to you when you provide answers so we could save some time so that we can maybe focus on questions that haven't been answered yet. Ms. Tate, have you been consulted by the Minister and the Minister's Advisory Board on the renewing of the mandate for CBC? I think it was in August that the presentation was made to this committee. It was an hour and a half long presentation, and we also answered questions in writing. What recommendations did you make to this advisory committee in order to improve or modify the mandate of CBC Radio-Canada, that changes that you would like to see implemented soon? Well, for us, it's not about changing the mandate. It's very clear for us. We have the same mandate as all public broadcasters anywhere in the world. It is to inform, enlighten, and entertain our public. So it's, for us, a question of how we can improve and what we can improve. And I think it's our services in the different regions of the country. And that was provided in our answers. So we need journalists across the country, everywhere, to do that. That's an excellent point because regional coverage is extremely fragile, and a public broadcaster has an important role to play in terms of the survival of regional news and information. The public broadcaster, if it had the possibility of investing more in some areas, what areas would you like to see more financial support so that you can come up with more interesting or more profitable ideas for the corporation? We know that we live in a more and more digital world. So we need that component to remain relevant. And we're looking at artificial intelligence. And there's a lot that could be done in terms of the technology, but especially in the different regions, it's about working with independent producers in Manitoba, not just Montreal, but across the country. So would it be part of the mandate of the public broadcaster, CBC Radio-Canada, to provide infrastructure to the private regional producers who wouldn't be able to develop this kind of infrastructure? Yes, of course. We are developing relationships with community radios in Quebec, for instance, to share our content so that they can have access to our facilities. So we can also say that if CBC Radio-Canada were to be defunded, that would impact services in French, but smaller producers who could collaborate with the CBC Radio-Canada. Yes, the whole ecosystem, because you have independent producers as well. Thank you very much.
2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the one hand, in this committee, we've seen from the Liberals who espouse their support for the CBC, and yet we're the ones to threaten cuts to the CBC that led to job losses. It's also the same Liberals that approved $18 million worth of bonuses at a time when Canadians are struggling and so many journalists at the CBC have lost their jobs. On the other hand, we have the Conservatives who've attacked the CBC and made a campaign around defunding the CBC a key part of their platform, an attack that is truly an attack on our communities, on the vitality of the ability to tell our stories, and of course, in terms of our Canadian identity. The reality is that Canadians deserve a CBC that is accountable to them, a CBC that is in touch with them on all fronts. And that means banning executive bonuses. At a time when jobs are being cut at the CBC, it's important that we see leadership from our public broadcaster that doesn't prioritize executive bonuses at the expense of jobs and local broadcasting. We also need to see a public broadcaster that invests in local journalism. I've often talked about my region that has not had a permanent CBC presence despite having a CBC station for years. And so commitments to local and regional broadcasting ring hollow when the CBC has been incapable year after year to get the job done and make sure that our region that services 85,000 people has a CBC presence. We certainly hope that the new person that we're expecting to come on board in the new year has the support necessary from CBC Manitoba, from our public broadcaster to make sure that our region is heard. We also want to make sure that other local and regional broadcasters have the support necessary to do its work. The CBC isn't about getting the news out of Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver. It's about all of us. So as we see a new CEO coming in, as we expect to hear a new mandate from the CBC, our hope from the NDP is that we see a strong CBC, Radio-Canada, that ensures that executive bonuses are being that we're not seeing executive bonuses, that we are banning executive bonuses, that we are in fact hiring journalists, local broadcasters, opening up stations that have been shuttered, ensuring that gaps, including in media deserts, are being filled.
Please wind up, Ms. Ashton. Thank you.
And that we're also seeing that the CBC stands up for all of us. I'm concerned that your tenure, Ms. Tate, has not seen that kind of commitment. Canadians deserve a strong CBC, a strong Radio-Canada, and we will continue to fight for that. Thank you.
I don't think there was a question there, Ms. Tate. And now, you wanted to respond quickly, but we're running out of time for this round. Go ahead.
I just want to say, though, to speak of the tenure, I want to make a couple of points. During my tenure, I am so proud of the work that we have done. We have launched CBC Gem, a video streaming service that is devoted to Canadian content, news, local news. We have launched Audio à Radio-Canada, the top Canadian-operated audio streaming service in the French language in this country. We have tripled digital revenues. We have, for the first time, knocked the Olympics and the Paralympics out of the park. You're telling me I have enough. Okay.
Guys, we've got 10 minutes and we've got 2 5-minute slots. I'm going to really cut everybody off if they go beyond their time. So, Mr. Scheer for 2.5 minutes, and then I understand you're sharing it with Mr. Kurek for 2.5. So I'm going to cut you off, guys. All right?
I'll get right to it. Ms. Tate, would you categorize your term at the CBC as a success?
Yes.
So you believe that you've left it in a better place than how you found it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So if I just go through a few things, and I just have to say you must have quite the echo chamber there if you believe that, because when we're talking about how out of touch the CBC can be with Canadians, you only need to look at the bonuses that you paid out during an affordability crisis to executives and senior management while laying off the frontline staff, something that even Peter Mansbridge called the CBC out for. When we look at all the metrics, all the key performance indicators, ad revenue overall down, trust is down, despite polls that the CBC might have commissioned for itself. Independent third-party organizations that analyze this indicate that trust in the CBC fell 17% in just 4 years. Viewership is down. less than 3% in primetime markets. That means during prime time, when Canadians are getting into living rooms to watch what is on TV, 97% of Canadians say no to the CBC, tune it out, and move on to other things. Based on all of that, Ms. Tate, I just want to say, on behalf of the Conservative Party, I want to thank you for your efforts in helping us promote the campaign to defund the CBC. Because I think outside of the Conservative caucus, you have been the most successful person in creating the demand to defund the CBC. $1.4 billion of taxpayers' money doesn't go for an online streaming service. It goes to a whole host of products in which Canadians are choosing other sources of information and entertainment. So again, I don't really have a question there. I just wanted to say thank you for your efforts to help us defund the CBC.
Did you have a comment?
I must say that it really does shock me the extent to which certain members of this committee and sups in, or whatever you call it, seem to make me the target and throw insults to my tenure at CBC Radio-Canada in order to discredit the organization. The organization has stood for 90 years, and we know 79% of Canadians say they believe that CBC Radio-Canada should continue. And so to have this be somehow a proof that that we should be defunding the CBC is ridiculous.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. So I understand Mr. Kurek is not sharing with you. Go ahead, Mr. Scheer.
Just want to point out that those were not insults. It may be insulting to hear that ad revenue is down, but that is just a fact. It may be insulting to hear that 97% of Canadians choose to watch other things on TV other than the CBC, but that is just a fact. It is just a fact that trust in the CBC has fallen by 17% in just 4 years. When I had a chance to ask you about trust in the CBC, one of your responses back was that corrections were up, that the number of corrections that the CBC News issued is up, and that was a proof, some kind of evidence that the CBC could be trusted. I look at it the other way. When you have a falsehood broadcast on the national news, and then a correction that follows up a few days later, or on an online post, that doesn't instill confidence and trust in the CBC. It points out that the CBC allows things to get to air before doing proper vetting, validation, and fact-checking. And it may be insulting to hear the dollar amounts about executive bonuses, but I'll tell you who was really insulted. The frontline workers that were laid off when the CBC was claiming it didn't have enough money to keep that entire workforce, and then reads in the paper or reads on a news source other than the CBC, because they probably weren't watching it either, that senior management and executive all got bonuses. So again, those are just facts. Everything I have listed off
15
comes
seconds.
from third-party independent sources that have indicated all that. And so I just want to again say thanks for your help in our efforts to defund the CBC.
Mr. Scheer. I now go to the Liberals for the last piece, and it's going to be Mr. New Mohammed for 5 minutes.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Mr. Scheer for that deeply unserious monologue and for popping into the committee without having heard any of what had happened before. I mean, I guess this is a pattern that we're seeing from conservatives of trying to bring U.S.-style misinformation. But I guess that's second nature for some of those folks, and that's fine. I think it's also important that if we're going to start casting aspersions, I suspect there are members of the Conservative Party who probably want to know where their money went during the tenure of Mr. Scheer's leadership, but we're not here to discuss that. What I would like to talk about, Madame Tate, first of all, is facts, because there seem to be those in short supply from our friends opposite today. We heard this monologue of things that haven't gone well because they've chosen to manipulate data in a particular way. I'd like to go back and ask specifically and sharply, talking about platforms, can you talk about CBC's size and scope across all platforms? Because they seem to think that television broadcast is the only thing that media companies are measured by. Can you talk about all platforms?
So during my tenure, CBC.ca and radiocanada.ca have become the #1 digital news destination in the country. 21 million Canadians use our .ca or .ca news sites.
So for the folks in the room that may not understand what number one means, does that mean above all of the other private broadcasters?
That means above all other Canadian services. Google and Facebook are still higher than the Canadian services, but we are number one in terms of news sites.
So just to clarify, the public broadcaster is doing better than the private enterprises that are in the same business, Canadian private businesses in the sector.
Not on all platforms, but I'm talking specifically about news.
Yes,
with respect to Tout.TV, the streaming service of Radio-Canada is number one in the French market. CBC Gem ranks number two behind Crave. Listen, when we talk about performance, today television is one piece of a very, very complex operation, multi-platform operation. And you can slice it and dice it every which way. But I would like to, if I may, Madam Chair, just read a little letter that I received this morning. I remembered that Member Waugh had some letters from Saskatoon, and this one literally came in over my desk this morning. Dear Madam, I've listened and watched CBC for over 75 years. Only 2 channels are on my radio, CBC 1 and CBC 2, and I rely on CBC TV News for truthful and unbiased reporting. Here are some of the things that CBC does right. News, local, national, investigative, the arts, music, live concerts, French, ethnic, comedy shows, movies, coverage of historic events, children's programming, literature reviews. I know I've missed some of the programs, but the caliber of hosts, journalists, presenters, and technicians is so excellent. Please pass on to all of the staff at CBC my grateful thanks for providing me the world in my armchair, free, unbiased, informative, and pleasurable. Let's hope the CBC continues for years to come. Regards from a faithful listener. I won't give her last name, but her first name is Judith.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. Madam Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have about 1 minute. No, you've got 2 minutes left, Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Tate, I was just reflecting on what we used to watch when we were growing up, because we didn't have cable, so we watched the CBC, and there was a lot of lessons that Mr. Dressup taught us. And one of them was about being truthful and about understanding all of the things around us so that we could decide how we were going to show up. And I find it disappointing that a lot of the conversations that we have had with you have been around a base set of facts, quote unquote, that actually are not grounded in reality at all. I mean, this whole notion of performance pay versus bonuses has been something that we have litigated a million times, this committee. The whole question of how the CBC is performing relative to other platforms when it comes to news in this country has been something that has been tossed around like a political football. So I just kind of want to end my questions with you today around the whole concept that we have heard of from the Conservatives. And Mr. Scheer laid bare today that there is an active campaign to defund the CBC. I think it's important for us to defend the CBC. But I want you, in very brief terms, to say to Canadians and Quebecers what defunding the CBC, like Mr. Scheer wants to do, will actually mean for small communities, for large communities, for the news ecosystem in this country, and for Canadians at large. If you could summarize that in 1 minute or less.
Actually, she does not have 1 minute. She has 30 seconds. I know you can do it, Ms. Tate.
Okay, here we go. The dangers of defunding CBC means denying 80% of the population local news, 95,000 hours of local news radio programming, 45,000 hours of Canadian TV content. It means denying thousands of independent producers, tens of thousands of independent producers, creators, musicians, performers, technicians, their livelihood. It means denying the North access to each other and to the South. It means denying French minority communities their connection to their language. It means cutting at least 3,500 jobs.
Thank you, Isat. Did you finish, Ms. Tate? You have another couple of minutes to go, seconds to go.
You said seconds. Okay.
I said seconds, yeah, go ahead.
That's fine. One last thing, it means that Canadians would not have access to international news presented to them by Canadian journalists. Nos correspondants à l'international, c'est quand même...
We have our international reporters, and that's a key asset.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to ask you questions again, but in the words of Mr. Dressup, keep your crayons sharp, keep your sticky tape untangled, and always put the tops back on your markers.
Thank you very much. Before we end the meeting, because we're coming along to end it now, I wanted to say, Ms. Tate, ask you a question. I know we've been hearing, and I've been listening to all these hearings, we've been hearing bandied about the idea that you make more money than the Prime Minister. I know that we had Bell Canada here, and I know the Conservatives themselves and everyone at this table was appalled at the layoffs at Bell Canada when the CEO is making $13 million a year. And I remember people asking if he would give up some of that for his to keep his staff. But I just wanted to ask you, if given that kind of salary for a CEO of a private broadcaster, what would happen if there was no more CBC and we had to depend only on private broadcasting to give us the news, given that I know in my neck of the woods in British Columbia, a lot of people cannot get news other than CBC. So what would happen? Thank you.
What would happen is that many communities across the country, I can't hear because these people are talking so loudly.
Yes, I know. Can you please allow the witness to speak? Thank you.
What would happen is we would have more news deserts. Already in Canada, there are many communities where private news has had to have, news organizations have shuttered. And that would just accelerate. With the absence of CBC Radio-Canada, you in your community would have no Canadian news. What that means is you would depend on Facebook and on Google and on other foreign services to get your news. And I would say that that will be absolutely, it will make Canada no better. In fact, it will make it worse. So I guess that's what I would say to that.
I want to thank you, Ms. Tate, for coming. I want to thank you for coming over and over. I suppose you've been here so often. We should make you a member of the committee, perhaps. But I would like to now thank you very much, and I am going to call this meeting adjourned.